It began in the quiet suburb of Fairview, where life seemed safe, predictable, and untouched by the kind of evil that often makes headlines. Emily Carter, a 27-year-old freelance illustrator, was known for her calm demeanor, her love for sketching, and her habit of keeping a journal. Her diary wasn't just a record of her daily thoughts. It was her sanctuary, the place she confided everything she couldn't say aloud. When her body was discovered in her apartment one cold November morning, the shock that rippled through the community was immediate. But what stood out most wasn't just the tragedy of her death. It was the eerie discovery inside her journal, a chilling note written in her own handwriting, suggesting she had chosen to end her life. At first glance, it looked convincing. The slant, the loops, the very pressure of the pen seemed identical to Emily's authentic script. Police even photographed the entry, noting how it aligned with pages she had written just the week before. For those who didn't know her well, the narrative almost worked. Almost. But for those closest to her, something about the entry felt wrong. And as investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover the possibility that the final words in Emily's diary were not hers at all, but a forgery, a staged piece of evidence meant to mislead everyone into believing the impossible. What they didn't know yet was that this single forged journal entry would unravel a story of manipulation, betrayal, and murder, one carefully staged, but not perfect enough to withstand the truth. Emily's world had been one of quiet artistry. Friends described her as deeply empathetic, the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who stayed up late listening to a friend's troubles, who always carried a notebook filled with sketches and snippets of poetry. She lived alone in a modest apartment decorated with soft pastels and second-hand furniture. To outsiders, her life looked peaceful. But within her circle, it was known she had recently been struggling with the sudden end of a relationship and the pressures of making a living through freelance work. Her ex-boyfriend, Daniel Reeves, was a name that surfaced almost immediately. Daniel, charming on the surface but often controlling, had left her a few months before her death. Friends recalled Emily confiding that Daniel hated her journaling, calling it a waste of time. That detail seemed small then, but would later become crucial. The night before she was found, neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual, no arguments, no strange noises. It was as if Emily had simply gone to bed and never woken up. But the journal entry told another story, one that suggested deliberate intent on her part. Investigators initially leaned toward believing it. Suicide notes are rare, but not unheard of, and Emily's apparent struggles added weight to the theory. The handwriting analysis appeared to confirm it. But still, doubts lingered. Her best friend, Chloe, told detectives. Emily never wrote about giving up. Her journal was her place of hope, even when she was hurting. That entry, it doesn't sound like her. If Chloe was right, and the note wasn't Emily's, then someone close to her had not only killed her but used her own words and handwriting against her. The alleged final entry read, "I am tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of pretending I'm okay. Maybe I was never meant for this life. Please forgive me, whoever reads this." At first glance, the phrasing seemed hauntingly believable. Investigators compared the loops of her letters, the slant of her T's, the way she dotted her I's. It looked authentic. But Chloe noticed something the police initially overlooked. Emily never used the phrase "tired of pretending." In years of journals, scanned and kept privately on her computer, Chloe had never seen Emily phrase things that way. Another friend pointed out that Emily always signed her journal entries with a flourish, a small doodle or a short phrase of gratitude, no matter how dark the entry. This final note ended abruptly, without her usual touch. Forensic handwriting experts were brought in. Their initial report: the writing is consistent with Emily Carter's hand. It seemed the case was closing before it had even begun. But handwriting analysis is not foolproof. And beneath the surface, tiny inconsistencies began to reveal themselves. Differences in pen pressure, unnatural hesitations in letter strokes, as if someone had carefully slowed down while mimicking her style. If the note was indeed forged, then the killer wasn't just someone who knew Emily. They were someone who had studied her most private thoughts in order to weaponize them. Investigators turned their attention to the night of Emily's death. Her phone records showed she had exchanged messages with Chloe around 9:45 p.m., light-hearted ones about a new art commission she had landed. Nothing in her tone suggested despair. By 11 p.m., her phone went dark. No calls, no texts, nothing. The following morning, Chloe went to check on her after Emily missed a coffee date, something she never did without texting. When Chloe arrived, she found the door unlocked. The living room was neat, but the journal sat on the desk, opened to the chilling final entry. The police ruled it suspicious but not definitive. Yet Chloe insisted Emily would never leave her door unlocked. And the placement of the journal itself was unusual. Emily normally kept it by her bedside, not in the living room. More unsettling was the discovery that Emily's pen, the one she always used for journaling, wasn't found near the notebook. Instead, it was tucked inside a drawer across the room, wiped clean of prints. Why would someone carefully stage a journal entry, but forget the smallest details of Emily's habits? Daniel Reeves quickly became the primary person of interest. His history with Emily was complicated: volatile arguments, repeated breakups, and a reputation for manipulation. Detectives discovered that Daniel still had a key to Emily's apartment. He admitted to dropping by occasionally, though Emily had supposedly told friends she didn't want him in her life anymore. When questioned, Daniel seemed calm, even helpful. He insisted Emily had been spiraling and suggested the journal entry reflected her real state of mind. He even told detectives, "She always wrote about her feelings. If you read enough of those journals, you'll see this coming." But Daniel's claim raised alarm bells. How did he know what was in her journals? Emily was intensely private about them, sharing snippets only with Chloe. Police obtained a warrant and found traces of Daniel's fingerprints, not on the journal itself, but on the drawer where Emily's pen was found. His explanation: "I helped her move furniture last month." Still, the pieces didn't quite add up. He had access, knowledge of her private habits, and a motive rooted in resentment. But there wasn't yet enough to prove he had staged the note. The deeper police dug into Daniel's background, the more they realized his relationship with Emily had been far darker than anyone imagined. Through interviews with Emily's co-workers and friends, a troubling picture of Daniel emerged. He was controlling, often belittling her work as childish doodles. He would demand to know where she was at all times and occasionally showed up at her apartment uninvited. Emily's private messages, recovered from her laptop, revealed that she had been planning to cut ties with Daniel completely. She wrote to a friend just weeks before her death, "I think he's been going through my things. I found my journal slightly out of place last week. I can't shake the feeling he's reading it when I'm not home." That single message reframed everything. If Daniel had indeed been reading her journal, he would have had enough access to her handwriting, phrasing, and style to create a convincing forgery. Detectives began to suspect that the final entry was not only staged but written by someone who had studied Emily's most intimate words until they could replicate them perfectly. But handwriting wasn't the only piece of evidence Daniel had overlooked. Forensics would soon uncover a trace that no forgery could erase. While handwriting analysis can be subjective, ink analysis is far less forgiving. Forensic experts tested the final journal entry against previous ones and discovered something startling. The ink composition did not match Emily's usual pen. Though visually identical, the chemical makeup of the ink used in the final entry was different from the pens Emily had been using for months. This discovery cracked open the case. Whoever wrote that entry not only forged her handwriting but also used a pen Emily herself did not typically use. When police questioned Daniel about the discrepancy, he appeared rattled for the first time. He claimed Emily had plenty of pens lying around. But when Chloe was asked, she insisted Emily was particular about her stationery, often buying refills for the same brand of pen she'd used for years. The ink betrayed the forgery. But investigators still needed more than suspicion. They needed proof that Daniel himself had staged it. Detectives turned their attention to Daniel's digital footprint. His laptop, seized under a search warrant, revealed disturbing searches made just weeks before Emily's death. How to copy handwriting convincingly. Famous forged suicide notes. Can police tell if handwriting is faked? The searches painted a chilling picture. Daniel had researched exactly how to stage Emily's death as a suicide. But most damning was a file recovered from his desktop, a scanned image of one of Emily's old journal entries. Investigators theorized he had used it for practice, tracing her script until he could mimic it. When confronted, Daniel claimed it was part of a project he was working on, but he couldn't explain why such a project involved Emily's private writings. The evidence was tightening like a noose around Daniel, but police knew they needed one final, undeniable link before pressing charges. The turning point came when detectives re-examined the apartment. In Emily's wastebasket, buried under tissues and receipts, they found torn scraps of paper. On them were partial phrases written in Emily's handwriting, but jagged, uneven, as if someone had been practicing. One piece bore the words, "I am tired." Another, "Forgive me." Both were identical to the phrases in the staged entry. but the strokes showed hesitation, unnatural stops, and corrections. It was a smoking gun. Someone had been rehearsing Emily's last words before committing them to her journal. When shown the scraps, Daniel's composure cracked. He refused to answer questions, demanded a lawyer, and maintained his innocence. But by now, the case against him was overwhelming. Even as police prepared their case, one haunting question remained. What drove Daniel to go to such elaborate lengths, not just to kill, but to rewrite Emily's very last words? The answer lay in Daniel's psychology. Experts interviewed for the case described him as a classic manipulator, someone who needed to maintain control over Emily, even in death. By staging her death as a suicide, Daniel hoped to erase suspicion from himself, but more importantly, he wanted to dictate the narrative of her life's ending. To him, the final journal entry was the ultimate act of dominance, putting words in her mouth that she never would have written. For investigators, the realization was chilling. This wasn't just about hiding a crime, it was about rewriting a life. Daniel wanted the world to believe Emily had chosen despair, when in reality, she had been fighting for her independence from him. The forged entry nearly worked, but it was Emily's habits, her unique quirks, and the loyalty of her friends that exposed the lie. As the case prepared to go to trial, prosecutors would have to convince a jury that the handwriting that looked so real was, in fact, a mask for murder. The case against Daniel Reeves was no longer circumstantial. It was layered with digital searches, forensic evidence, and physical proof of forgery. Still, prosecutors knew the challenge ahead. Convincing a jury that handwriting that looked nearly identical to Emily's was actually a mask for murder. The defense built its argument quickly. They would claim Emily had been deeply depressed, that the digital searches were taken out of context, and that the scraps of paper were meaningless. Most importantly, they would lean on the credibility of the initial handwriting expert who had declared the final entry consistent with Emily's hand. For the prosecution, the strategy was clear. They had to show the jury not just how the forgery was created, but why. They needed to tell Emily's story, her habits, her words, her life, in a way that revealed how wrong the staged journal entry truly was. As the trial date loomed, friends and family prepared to face the courtroom, determined to make sure Emily's real voice wasn't lost behind the killer's lie. The stage was set for a battle not only over facts, but over the very meaning of Emily's life and death. When the trial began, the courtroom was silent as prosecutors laid out their case. They described Emily as a young woman full of hope, working hard to build her career, surrounded by friends who loved her. They painted Daniel as a manipulative ex-boyfriend who refused to let go, who broke into her apartment, killed her, and then staged her journal to make it look like she had chosen to end her life. The defense countered with a very different picture, Emily as troubled, isolated, and overwhelmed. They described Daniel as a concerned ex who had been unfairly targeted. She left us her own words, the defense attorney said, gesturing to the journal. And those words tell us she was tired of living. The jury leaned forward. It would not be an easy decision. On one side was the journal entry that seemed genuine. On the other was a mountain of subtle but damning evidence suggesting it was staged. Both sides knew the trial would hinge on whether the jury believed Emily truly wrote those last words, or whether they were the weapon of her killer. Emily's friends became some of the most powerful voices for the prosecution. Chloe, her best friend, took the stand and spoke with steady conviction. She told the jury how Emily always ended her journal entries with a doodle or note of gratitude. She described the day she found the door unlocked, the journal moved, and the pen hidden away. Other friends testified about Emily's optimism, her recent excitement over new projects, and her decision to cut ties with Daniel. She was planning for the future, one friend said. She wasn't giving up. The defense tried to discredit them, suggesting friends couldn't really know Emily's inner struggles. But their words were heartfelt, and their consistency left a deep impression. For the jury, it was the first time Emily's true personality began to break through the staged narrative Daniel had tried to impose. The case was no longer just about handwriting. It was about who Emily really was, and who Daniel had tried to make her appear to be. The prosecution's expert witness in forensic handwriting and ink analysis became a turning point. Calmly, he explained how handwriting can be imitated, how hesitation marks and unnatural pen pressure reveal forgery. Then he presented side-by-side comparisons of Emily's authentic entries and the staged one, highlighting subtle differences invisible to the untrained eye. The defense cross-examined fiercely, pointing to the earlier expert who claimed the entry was genuine. But then came the ink analysis. The prosecution demonstrated scientifically that the pen used in the final entry was not Emily's regular pen. It was a different brand entirely, with a different chemical composition. The courtroom murmured. Even if the handwriting could fool the eye, the ink itself told the truth. The jury began to see the staged entry not as Emily's final words, but as Daniel's false narrative, written with deliberate deception. Next came Daniel's laptop. Jurors were shown the chilling search history, how to copy handwriting convincingly, can police tell if handwriting is faked, and more. Then came the scanned journal entry saved on his computer, a page that investigators believed he had used for tracing practice. Daniel's defense tried to dismiss it as unrelated, a coincidence, a project he was working on. But when asked to explain the purpose of such a project, he had no answer. For the jury, the digital trail felt undeniable. It was as if Daniel had left fingerprints all over his plan to stage Emily's death. Each piece of evidence chipped away at his defense until the story he had crafted began to collapse under its own weight. Perhaps the most haunting evidence presented to the jury were the scraps of paper found in Emily's wastebasket. Jurors saw the jagged, halting words, "I am tired. Forgive me." Experts testified that the strokes showed hesitation, the kind of stops and starts that occur when someone is copying rather than writing naturally. And the words matched exactly the phrases in the final staged entry. The scraps revealed something chilling, that Daniel had practiced writing Emily's last words, rehearsing them until he could replicate her voice. The jury looked down at the pieces of paper in silence, as if staring at the discarded rehearsal notes of a crime. By then, the staged journal was no longer a piece of doubt. It was a weapon, crafted and sharpened by Daniel's hand. Against his attorney's advice, Daniel chose to testify. He spoke calmly at first, insisting he loved Emily, that he had been worried about her, and that the journal was proof of her despair. He described himself as misunderstood, painted himself as a victim of assumptions. But under cross-examination, cracks began to show. When asked how he knew what Emily wrote in her journals, he stumbled. When pressed about the digital searches, he grew defensive. And when shown the practice scraps again, his voice faltered. Jurors leaned in, watching his composure unravel. His answers grew evasive, his tone agitated. Instead of convincing them, his testimony only confirmed the image of a man desperate to maintain control, even in front of a jury. What was meant to save him only deepened the impression of his guilt. The prosecution delivered a powerful closing. They reminded the jury of Emily's true character, hopeful, planning for her future, unwilling to give up. They pointed to the ink test, the digital searches, the practice scraps, all evidence that the final journal entry was a forgery. This was not Emily's voice, the prosecutor said. This was Daniel's voice, forced onto her page. He killed her, and then he tried to erase her truth with his lie. The defense argued that reasonable doubt remained, that the handwriting was consistent, that Emily had been under pressure. They begged the jury not to convict on circumstantial evidence. But the jury had seen too much. The story Daniel tried to stage had unraveled, piece by piece, until only the truth remained. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom was tense, silent except for the shuffle of papers. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the foreperson said, "We find the defendant, Daniel Reeves, guilty." Gasps filled the room. Chloe and Emily's family wept quietly. Daniel sat motionless, staring ahead as if the weight of the verdict hadn't yet sunk in. For the first time, Emily's real voice was louder than the false one he had tried to create. The staged journal entry had nearly fooled everyone, but in the end, it became the very evidence that convicted him. Justice had spoken, not only for the crime itself, but for the attempt to silence and rewrite a life. After the trial, Emily's friends and family worked to reclaim her story. They organized an art exhibition in her honor, displaying her illustrations alongside passages from her authentic journals, her real words, full of hope, resilience, and dreams for the future. The forged entry was never mentioned in that exhibition. Instead, her true voice filled the gallery, line after line of thoughts that reflected who she really was. For many, it was a reminder that victims should never be remembered through the lies of their killers. Emily was not tired of pretending. She was not ready to give up. She was silenced by someone who wanted control. But in the end, his lie was exposed, and her truth endured. As the community gathered, Chloe spoke to the crowd. Emily's story reminds us that even when someone tries to erase a voice, truth finds a way to be heard. And for those watching the case unfold, one lesson lingered. No forgery, no staging, no manipulation can ever truly erase the truth.